probably should get started. We only have 15 minutes today, so I'll have to be pretty efficient. But don't worry, this is probably twice as long as your average doctor's appointment. My name is Gregory Schmidt. I'm an internal medicine resident in Canada. And today I'm looking forward to talk to you about breaking the medical cartel. Now, this medical cartel you may have heard of. It's worldwide. They have a monopoly on practically all of healthcare. It's regularly self-regulated. And admittedly, I am part of this cartel. I'm in internal medicine. And so when I tell my colleagues that I think it's a good idea for patients to be able to order their own tests or order their own treatments, they look at me kind of funny. But I hope to spend the next few minutes exploring this idea with you and showing you that I don't think patients should just be going off the shelf and randomly buying MRIs or trying new medications. But by changing the regulatory environment to make it legal for people to order their own tests or to order their own treatments, you could dramatically change the way we have innovation in healthcare delivery, as well as I think it's an essential step to the ultimate end goal of being able to do potential diagnosis without the involvement of clinicians, such as through artificial intelligence. And so today we'll be doing three things. First, we'll be talking about the future of healthcare. Then we'll be talking about the current state of healthcare. And then we'll end by talking about how the medical cartel is already being eroded in some ways. So let's talk about the future. I don't know, has anyone read Kevin Kelly's newest book, Inevitable? In this book, he says that something may be inevitable if you keep doing a thought experiment starting at different points in history, but you end up in the same place in the future. So when I do the thought experiment about healthcare, it seems that in the future, most of what doctors do today will be done not by doctors. And it may be done by machines, or it may be done by other clinicians which aren't physicians. And I actually think this is fantastic. And just to show you why, if you do an experiment of thinking of doctors as robots, and maybe in some of your cases it's not too hard a leap, but if you're trying to build this robot called the doctor, this is a terrible machine to build. It takes at least 10, 15, maybe 20 years just to construct one of these machines. It's going to cost about $250,000. And then once it's up and running, you don't even know how well it's going to interface with patients or interact with its robot clinicians. And don't even get me started on the annual upgrade and maintenance costs of these machines. So we have this very expensive, elaborate machine called the doctor. And if you were to take all the specific tasks that the doctor does and subdivide into specific entities, you could probably give a lot of these tasks to people with specific training in those areas, or to machines, which could do those tasks as well. And we actually already see this happening. For instance, nurses are able to insert central lines, and in cases even with lower infection rates than doctors. We see clinical assistants in the operating room doing harvesting of grafts and veins. We see in parts of Africa where you have task switching over the last few decades, and non-doctors have been trained to perform quite advanced obstetrical skills, which has saved the lives of many women and babies. We also see this in the delivery of care. We have an increasing, in some jurisdictions, ability for nurse practitioners to have essential independent license where they can provide primary care. In our hospitals, clinician assistants provide even greater care of patients on medical wards. And so we see this jurisdiction where you could imagine in the future, instead of training someone for 10 or 15 years in basic science and in basic research to ultimately, at the end of that training, learn how to do colonoscopies and then do colonoscopies only all day, perhaps you could train someone in just that specific skill at the start. And then you could train more people in discrete skills to increase the amount of availability of these skills and ultimately drop the price it costs to deliver them. So that's one way which doctors' tasks could be replaced. The one which we all want to talk about is artificial intelligence. And there's a lot of opportunity here, and if you do the thought experiment, we have increasing amounts of data about patients being generated, and it's well known that we have just an increasing velocity of medical research being generated. So ultimately, in the end game, a machine will be able to integrate these two enormous data sets better, I predict, than a human, and be able to produce a more personalized final test or test investigations and treatment for the patients. And I think this is good, not just because we'll have better diagnosis and better chronic disease management, but the thing that gets me really excited about the digitization of medicine is the fact that it could make healthcare free. Peter Diamandis, the founder of the X Prize, talks about the concept that once something is digitized, it essentially can be democratized, decentralized, and dematerialized. So if you think about this in healthcare, the people who actually need healthcare the most are people who can't afford to pay. And I just wanted to show you a few maps which really blew my mind when I saw them. This is a map here of the world from the WHO showing the systolic blood pressures of males over 18 around the world. And if you look, most parts of Canada and the US aren't that bad compared to the majority of the world. Similarly, this is a map here of fasting blood glucose for people over the age of 18 who are women around the world. Again, Canada, the US, Europe, it's a relatively light shade of green, but it's throughout the global south and Asia where you have significantly higher numbers of people with diabetes. And these are in countries where the ability to pay for diagnosis and chronic disease management is significantly less than we have here in the United States. So for instance, in this graph here, it shows how much is spent per person per year on total health expenditures in US dollars. And we see in dark blue here, over $5,000. The light blue here is between $1,000 and $5,000. And parts of the world here are in green, are maybe $300 to $1,000, or in here, $50, $30. And so I think it's very exciting that we could potentially deliver very, very high quality care in diagnosis and disease management, perhaps through one of the most democratized platforms in the world, the phone, which has an increasing bandwidth and accessibility throughout the world. And there's different discussions about how soon we'll have sort of worldwide access to the internet. And so I think the future of medicine is very exciting. Let's talk very briefly about the current state of medicine. As I said, medicine right now is probably a cartel. And this was put in place, in different ways in each country, but the impetus for it was to benefit patients. There was a time when it was very difficult to validate the credentials of the person treating you. You didn't know if they were a quack or if they were a licensed practitioner. And so there was a lot of reason to make it illegal to essentially not be properly licensed, and this benefited patients. But it seems that doctors over the last few decades have really been protecting themselves and not protecting patients. And there's lots of examples of this. Whenever it seems that nurses, pharmacists, clinical assistants try to grow the scope of their practice, try to grow the competencies of things that they're qualified to treat, to manage, and to diagnose, physicians push back, saying that to take that work away from doctors would be dangerous to the patients. And we've seen many examples of the ability for these non-physician practitioners to perform these tasks quite competently. We also see that doctors are reluctant to give control to patients. There was a time when we thought that patients wouldn't be able to take their own insulin, or take their own blood sugars and manage their own insulin. We thought there was a time when patients wouldn't be able to titrate their water pills, their diuretics, based on their heart failure symptoms. And both of these have been shown that patients can manage this. We thought initially blood pressure cuffs were only sold to clinicians, whereas now we encourage people to take their blood pressure at home. And this is, there's many different ways which patients are actually able to access their own data, which again was something that doctors thought would harm patients. Whereas now there's countries in the world where everyone in the country has complete access to all their labs. And some of you may be familiar with the Open Note study, which I feel very definitively show that patients report better outcomes when they have access to the entirety of the medical record, including even what their diagnosis is and what their primary care doctors write about them each clinic visit. There was a time not even 50 years ago when more than half of doctors wouldn't tell patients that they had cancer. Today that would be malpractice. And so it's hard to imagine that this cartel, which has been so reluctant to allow other people to take away small parts of their work, would be going into the future open arms, looking forward to the majority of what we do day to day, and get paid well to do day to day, would be taken away from them. But the cartel is being eroded. I think there's probably at least 5 different ways that the cartel today is being eroded. First, it's changing in patients. Patients have much higher expectations of doctors today, and doctors no longer have the ivory tower ability to say things that their patients will inevitably do. 1 in 3 patients go to alternative care providers in North America, and when they do seek alternative care, 3/4 of those people don't tell their doctor that they're seeing someone else. And so doctors really need to make the case to their patients that they have trust and that they're able to offer their patients something that the patients are looking for. The second way that the cartel is being eroded is simply with the regulatory environment. Governments are increasingly interested in allowing non-physicians to have greater scopes of practice. It's simply cheaper for them to run the health budgets. And so in my country, at least in Canada, we've seen very large growth in nurse practitioners and physician assistants, in clinical pharmacists, and governments are increasingly interested in opening up medicine in this way. The last three ways the cartel is being eroded is with the change in patient behavior. We see patients able to generate a lot more data themselves than they ever could. There was a time when the only data patients could generate was that which was either generated in the doctor's office or in the tests the doctor's ordered. Now, you can pretty much sequence your own DNA yourself. In fact, I think I heard last week that 23andMe will be selling their product off the shelf in Target soon. Patients have the ability to, do home glucose, home HIV, home hepatitis markers, home pregnancy tests are quite common. And it's unknown, but in many states it's not illegal to buy your own labs without a doctor's, paperwork. There was a big news article, of course, a year ago when Arizona changed their law, which made it legal to buy your own lab testing in Arizona. And of course, there's all these ways that patients are able to generate more data. The fourth way is patients are able to generate their own diagnosis. And I'll admit, this is sort of the weakest link so far. The ability to generate your own diagnosis is a highly underdeveloped part of medicine. We know online diagnosis tools are very inaccurate, and even the paid dermatology apps, which are emerging currently on smartphones, this recent studies show that they don't even provide that good a diagnosis. But I feel this is because the area is underdeveloped, not because we've reached max potential. And if you look at the work that Google has done with DeepMind in the last year, it's incredible that they're able to diagnose diabetic retinopathy better than skilled ophthalmologists using their computer algorithms. So it will only be a time when the ability to diagnose through computer learning will be more reliable and more accurate and far cheaper than doctors. And finally, the last one, patients are initiating their own treatments. We've seen the change in the eyeglass industry where people can go online and buy their own contacts and buy their own lenses. If you go to a pharmacist today, you can buy far more over-the-counter medications than years ago without the help of a pharmacist. And with the help of a pharmacist, you have quite an array of medications depending on the jurisdiction you're in that you can purchase without a doctor being involved. And so we're kind of entered already the Wild West. And of course, the question of antibiotics always comes up. And I feel that we're already in the Wild West of antibiotics. Admittedly, doctors haven't been good stewards of them. Patients demand antibiotics, and it's so much easier to give antibiotics to people even when you know they don't need them. In many developing countries, it's very easy to access antibiotics. Even in New York, which maybe in California they consider it a developing country, but in New York, you can very easily get sort of off the streets antibiotics. You can go to any fish market, you can go to any pet store, you get antibiotics in the pet store. And of course, you can go online and buy literally any medication provided it's not a controlled substance. And depending on the jurisdiction of where you're buying that online pharmacy from, you don't even need a doctor's prescription. And so ultimately, the way which I think we'll be able to move forward and help patients isn't through creating stronger cartels and stronger regulation, but it's to change our culture of health. We've grown up in an industry or sort of in an age where people have completely outsourced their health to doctors. It's remarkable if you think about it. When you graduate from high school, you don't know the basic life-saving things like CPR. You don't know the signs or the symptoms of a heart attack. You don't know what diabetes is, high blood pressure, hypertension. And you don't know how to prevent this or how to manage this or even what these conditions are. Interestingly, a lot of people also don't know how doctors think, why sometimes we're reluctant to pursue certain treatments, and how we sort of balance data. But if we can help change our culture and educate people to be more empowered, to understand how doctors think, and to understand more that it's dangerous to just randomly order tests or to randomly take medications, we can create this legal ability not for patients to do it on their own, but so that other healthcare professionals can develop sort of new industries, and so that artificial intelligence can really get to its end game of being able to provide worldwide healthcare for close to free. So I just wanted to end on the fact that saying I think the future of medicine is very exciting. Where does this leave doctors? I guess very quickly I should say, I think it's actually a very exciting time to be a doctor, because most of what we get paid very well today to do is routine, repetitive work. Whereas in the future, doctors will have the competitive advantage in that they'll be the people in the ecosystem trained the best to think deeply, to do research, and to really go after the most complicated of patients, which don't fall into the algorithms, which fit outside the box, that have diagnoses which remain uncertain, and conditions which remain improperly treated. And right now, these are the patients which I feel our current healthcare system serves the least, because there's no financial incentive or reward to really take time to solve the most complicated of patients and conditions. But in the future, these will be the opportunities of what doctors can be involved in. And of course, there'll be emerging fields in medicine which don't even exist: organ printing, genomics, programming of cognitive systems. There'll be lots of work for doctors to do, so I don't think we should feel that we'll be out of a job. And so I thank you for your attention and appreciate your interest in the subject.
We have some time for some questions.
We're speaking a lot about the democratization of medical knowledge. We've seen that happen in a lot of other industries through these MOOCs, massive online courses, where now university degrees in engineering, computer science can basically be accessed online for free. That hasn't happened to the same extent maybe for medical school curriculum. Do you think that should happen, that will happen? Can it be safely sort of communicated to the broader community?
It's a great question. I mean, it's the perpetual question of why are there so few doctors? Well, obviously we don't want more doctors, because then we'll have a surplus, which is really bad for, if you think about supply and demand economics and salaries. There are some countries which have twice the number of doctors we have in, Canada, for instance, but they're paid half the amount. We do see in countries where there's necessity to form and train more physicians, that there's different startups trying to do sort of mass education in clinical sciences. I don't know the names offhand, but I've seen a few of their websites. And they're specifically forming training programs for people working in Africa to provide care. So I think that that's just inevitably going to happen. But it's interesting that of all the sectors which sort of used to be self-contained, whether it's journalism, video, engineering, it's really medicine is kind of the end of that stream of democratization.
One of your arguments was that we essentially build technicians, like for colonoscopies, for example, that you can have better streamline of care. But isn't that one of the criticisms now of medicine, that there is no one managing the care, and so we have so many specialists that no one talks to each other? And then subsequently, follow up and another slight concern is that the patient voice or patient being able to understand all these items is dependent on like formal education of some sort. And I think in the United States, at least, I can't speak for Canada, the average reading level is at second grade level. So how do those patients play into it, especially with the antibiotic example we gave, the vaccination argument that we still have, where that's not always a good thing?
I think we need to be able to create systems where people can know that the source they're using is reliable. And whether that source is a doctor, a nurse, or a computer, or a phone module. And it needs to be a simple system. And I don't know if this is either a government regulated system, or you could imagine independent companies forming where the whole crux of their industry is validating medical apps for reliability of outcomes. And I think that could help streamline that process for people choosing if the sources that they're using they should follow or not. If you buy a painting at Christie's auction house, you expect that it's not a fake. And it's because the whole reliability of that company relies on authenticity. And I think that we could get around this problem of how do you know where to look for information by being able to provide certification of both the online pharmacies, whether that's through blockchain or different ways to validate the authenticity of that, and the same could be done for clinical cognitive systems. Talking on your point about the fragmentation of healthcare, my thesis on that is actually that ultimately it will be the EHR which becomes the quarterback of care, which in some ways sounds very impersonal, but I think on a practical level, the level of follow-up of detail of tests and investigations in 21st century medicine is so complicated that it's just practically a numbers game and impossible to have enough physicians to be able to follow up on all the tests that need to be reordered. And so all this will be centralized into a back-end EHR, which will help alert patients when they need to pursue next steps, which patients will be able to reach out to when they have new symptoms. And then that will reroute them into the appropriate clinicians.
Greg, great talk, and I just want to comment on that. I wonder if there is room for a different type of work for physicians or others that is more the type of a health broker. So you actually you would be skilled in understanding the bigger picture and supporting patients in making decisions based on all the other things that they have already done. Not prescribing, not treating, but you are helping to manage that knowledge in a more efficient way and are that human connection to treatment that the separation of different technicians would make missing.
I agree sort of with that vision of that the physician ultimately will be the broker at the top. Right now, healthcare works in that regardless of your entrance complaint, you automatically go to the doctor at the start. Whereas if you think about this in any other industry, if your car makes a funny sound, you don't go straight to the engineers at Toyota. You go on the line, you talk to your friends, you try to work it out yourself, and then you might go down the street, and if that doesn't work, you go to the Toyota dealership, and ultimately you keep escalating through the cascade of expertise. And so I see that we'll be developing a cascade of expertise, which has relative different prices at each point, but ultimately, if things remain unsolved, that at the top of the cascade, you can have the physician who can help broker that.
I think we actually.
Certainly. Thank you very much.